Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's so great to see all of you in person and online too. Hi. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Laura Knutson, not as it says on the slide, Josie Clerk, and I'm the EPA Community Involvement Coordinator for the site. And I'm just going to kick things off briefly. So, because this is an important presentation tonight, and we're calling this kind of presentation an EPA feedback loop presentation. And a lot of you were at the presentation back in September that the Swan Island Basin parties gave on the sweet spot of, we're calling it, for the design process at the Swan Island Basin project area. So the sweet spot is where in the design process for each project area, community feedback makes the most sense for EPA to consider and decide what feedback makes sense to pass along to the performing parties, in this case, the Swan Island Basin Group, to consider in their next design document, and what doesn't make sense and why. We need to explain that. So that's what Josie is going to be doing tonight in just a second. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. And go ahead and click through these, please. There's some animation tonight. I think there's one more. So that's essentially what we're going to be doing. Josie's going to do a quick overview of where we're at in the design process, and then going through what feedback was carried forward, what wasn't carried forward, and why. And then quick wrap up. Next slide. One more slide for me. All right. No, actually, it's going to you. So the last thing I'll say about this, to cue Josie up before she goes into this slide, is that a lot of the feedback we received, informal feedback from community members, and thank you all so much for giving it to us via the Willamette River Advocacy Group, and thanks to them too. I know Emil is online. I know there's members in the room. A lot of it was pretty technical. So some of the slides that Josie's going to go through are a little bit dense, but just wanted to make sure that we captured the feedback that was given to us, and we can go through it. And also, we're going to pause briefly after each section of feedback because it's a lot to go through to see if anyone has any questions. We don't have a ton of time until 8, but Josie and I are going to stay around too. So if anyone wants to stay longer at 8, you can all leave. I know Triangle is going to let that happen. But if you want to stay longer online or in the room to talk through any pieces, please do. And we're going to go through all the slides by 8 though. So, but we can come back to them. So just take a note if you're wanting to come back to a certain section. So Josie, on to you.
Right. Thank you, Laura. All right, so this is a really helpful graphic to show where Swan Island Basin is in the harbor. It is that little inlet off on the eastern side of the river. The performing parties for Swan Island Basin are Vigor and Daimler, and that means that these are the two companies who step forward to say, yes, we will do the remedial design. They've contracted with folks, scientists, to do that work. And then they have a number of funding parties who are also helping to fund that work. Who's controlling that? All right, Ben, lay it on me. Keep going. Oh yeah, more. That's not all the funding parties. There, oh, yeah, okay. So they have this is a big group. This site represents about a quarter of the known contaminated sediments in the site. And a lot of people had a hand in putting that contamination there, and a lot of them have come in to help fund that work. Okay. This is kind of a laundry list of the most recent deliverables that they've provided to EPA and where they're headed with their design. So the basis of design report for Swan Island Basin is their sweet spot. It's the deliverable in which they presented their preliminary design. And they are not doing a 30% design. They're going straight from their basis of design report into a 50% design. And so that's why oftentimes the sweet spot is going to happen at the 30% design. But for Swan Island Basin, they're on a slightly different schedule. So for us, it made sense to get this community feedback in the basis of design report. So they did their draft. EPA is on a faster turn with comments, so they've already revised that document based on EPA input and the tribes and the state who we work with on that. and they've submitted their remedial design work plan to us, which we're reviewing right now, which is a document that lays out kind of all the steps they're going to take in the remainder of getting to 100% design. Are we good on the slides? Yeah, okay, next slide. And so the basis of design report, this is actually, Dwight did an awesome job of explaining what's in a basis of design report. This is the same for the Swan Island basis of design report as well. It's a lot of the summary of the environmental data they have so far and what it means. It also talks through the physical constraints of the site and the commercial use constraints of the site and how those are going to inform design. And so this was the document that Marcus Griswold reviewed on behalf of the WRAG, and that the Swan Island Basin team, Barbara's in the back, they did a nice job of providing this at a previous collaborative meeting for general input and conversation. Next slide. All right, now we're gonna do it. We're gonna go through all the comments. I'm gonna talk about which ones EPA's put forward, and for the ones that we didn't talk about, either where they ended up instead or why they didn't feel like they were meaningful to the process in this moment. So starting with, is it possible for me to get rid of the bar on my vision? So we got some good information on local receptors that should be considered when Swan Island Basin is thinking about the mitigating impacts of the construction. So we absolutely passed that forward. And then there were some good thoughts about issues that really end up in our community impacts mitigation plan. So this is a ask to think about mitigation for loss of work time or employees affected by remedial action. That one is going to be tough. We're going to think about it, but that's not something that Superfund sites typically do. Also, to seek stringent performance measures for air monitoring during remedial action. This is a section that's in the Community Impacts Mitigation Plan, which is currently, we've publicly released the draft, but we anticipate updating it again before in 2025. And then also Swan Island Boat Ramp. Right now, it is one of the few public boat ramps along the eastern shore. Based on property transactions, it might not be in place anymore by the time we get into remedial action, but if it is, that's an outreach point that we would need to work with Portland Parks and the public on. Next slide. The contamination on the main channel west of Swan Island. So if you look in at this, the bottom left-hand side here, this is a part of the river that was not in a project area initially. There weren't known surface contamination areas. Some sampling that came back from a maintenance dredging project and some other data from some of the EPA fund lead work has shown that there might actually be contamination there we need to worry about. And so this was an ask for the community of who's going to do that. It is not within the project area that Swan Island Basin agreed to do the remedial action for, or the remedial design for, excuse me. It is kind of sandwiched there between our Fund Lead 9 work and the Swan Island Basin project area. EPA needs to go back out for our own work in the next year to do a little bit more sampling, and so we're going to roll that into EPA work to take more samples in that area and determine whether it needs to go in for full remedial design or not. I'm pausing. Any questions so far? I forgot I was supposed to stop.
This is Barbara Quinn.
Yes, I'm wondering if you can describe the difference between the performing parties and the funding parties.
Yeah, the performing parties are the ones actually doing the work and making sure the work gets done. And then the funding parties have a side agreement with them and they're just giving money. Does that make sense? Okay.
Great. And I see a question from Laura online.
Yeah, hi. I'm just wondering if you're going to roll in, if contamination is found outside of the area of concern and you'll deal with it further downstream if you catch it, how are you going to know it's coming from Swan Island and that needs to be dealt with at Swan Island?
As part of our designs, we do something called a sufficiency assessment where we look at potential ongoing sources to the river of contaminants. And so we would go through that process. I don't think we're trying to figure out who's the cause of the contamination at this point. We're just trying to figure out kind of the quantities of it and where it is and whether it should be kept for whether we should do more design work in that area or not.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Sort of, kind of. I mean, I still feel like if Swan Island is generating something that's going, into the river at large, one needs to know that.
Oh, so Swan Island especially, can you go back to that slide that shows that picture? The main part of that peninsula is Vigor shipyards and some other, Barbara might know off the top of her head. These are facilities that are going through DEQ's source control program. Vigor's at the tail end of doing a lot of stormwater treatment. So I'm not worried about ongoing sources. I think that's being dealt with through other programs.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, take me back, Ben. Okay, this one, ignore the part where it says in situ stabilization. That's not what this is about. This is about capping. And some of the feedback we got was around some of the technical details to consider during capping. So this is not a comment we're going to bring forward. We will wait to receive that information in the 50% design from Swan Island. But know that one of the things that EPA actually does as part of our review is to ensure that these designs are going to be protective and that they will, to the best of our knowledge, will adequately contain the material they're being put in place to contain. And also there's going to be monitoring after these caps are installed. So that 5-year review process that Annie was talking about, that will also continue for all the caps in Portland Harbor. And so we will continue to know whether the caps perform as we're expecting them to perform for all time. All right.
Any questions?
Keep going.
And just so you know, I know some people are taking a few photos. These are part of the material packet that were emailed in case you want to go back and look at these later today or later.
Habitat. We got good input on habitat, and for the most part, we passed all of those forward. This is specifically for in the workaround structures. So one thing, as you saw from in that first picture, if you noticed, Swan Island Basin is a big industrial part of the harbor. There's a lot of working docks there. There's dry docks. There's bulkheads. So a lot of when they think about whether they're going to cap or dredge in these areas, they need to consider the structural stability of existing infrastructure. And some of the comments that we got from the WRAG were to maximize habitat as we're thinking about that. That there's an area at the back of Swan Island Basin that's already got a softened bank and doesn't get as much ship traffic. And so that's a place that habitat should be absolutely considered. And also that if you are going to build a wall, that you can design them in ways that are more friendly to habitat and to aquatic critters who could live there. And I was talking with Marcus about this, and this is like you put little pockets, instead of just having a straight sheet pile wall, maybe you have some pockets on it so sediment can come in and critters can live there, or you stair step it a little bit so that there's a landing zone for those benthic critters. There's also an ask to describe the legal agreements that will be used near structures to ensure that future development will not release that capped contamination. This is those legal agreements we call institutional controls. And often this is done through easement or some, typically an easement to ensure, or in this case, if it's in DSL property, that when they'll know where these caps are, and when they decide whether to give permits for in-water work, they'll consider whether there's a cap there or not. This is being done programmatically. So there's something that was developed called a programmatic institutional control plan. And that really lays out what performing parties are going to need to meet in order to make these remedies protective in the long run. The expectation is that as part of RD, they will come up with a plan of, here's where we need to put in a proprietary control. They will be talking with upland property owners who might need to sign some kind of an easement so that we know it's a possibility that could happen, but the people who will actually be putting this legal agreement in place are whoever signs up to do remedial action through that agreement that Caleb talked about. Mm-hmm. All right, next, that was my pause. Questions?
Yeah, more questions. Any questions? Feel free to put your cards up or hands up, and I can let you know, Josie, when I see questions.
Okay, and Laura, do you still have your hand up for a new question? Nope. All right, next slide. All right, implementability. This is, interestingly, in the basis of design is really where we start to get into what is actually implementable given the physical constraints of the site. So the ask to prioritize habitat improvement and public access was sent forward. There's a specific ask for very specific plans to address impacts to community in the future. We didn't forward that because we're going a slightly different path. We've generated this site-wide community impacts mitigation plan, and we're asking parties to consider that in documents that we call a remedial action work plan, or a construction quality assurance quality control plan, or a water quality monitoring plan. So those will be wrapped into slightly different documents than what was recommended by the WRAG. And then lastly, impact on fish and lamprey. There was a request to use models and statistical, I can't read the whole thing, statistics to kind of better evaluate our impacts during remedial action when that happens. The way that the laws all work together, there's a lot of rigor around our water quality impacts and the way we're going to sample for that. We're going to be looking at the Clean Water Act, we're looking at state water quality criteria, we're looking at the Endangered Species Act, and those are really going to be our drivers around meeting water quality criteria rather than doing statistics on the data. Because we have very clear triggers that we have to meet in those laws. And we actually produced something called the Water Quality Monitoring Template for our performing parties to look at that lays out exactly what those expectations are. So for anyone who's interested, there's a live link in the site, and you can go look at what parameters will be sampled for and what criteria they'll be held to. Great. Yeah, hi, sir.
Hi, Laura Hess. Just a more general question, because these water quality monitoring, when the data comes out, is always really late, and it's just packaged in a nice report. How is it possible to access these data earlier and communicate it also with the community who might be in this area or active in the area? Because the reports are nice, but normal community members have no really access or cannot read those. So in general, there seems to be a huge gap between when data is collected and when it's being reported out.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I will acknowledge we haven't I think until we're actually getting into remedial action, we're not going to have all those final details. There's a couple different kinds of water quality monitoring that are going to happen. One is for turbidity, for just this, and that is instantaneous. We get that information right away, and there are very clear triggers that folks will be monitoring against. And so I think there's a world, like what we've seen on other Superfund sites, is you get either a weekly update on whether the site is meeting those criteria or not. So that's one thing I've seen that seems appealing. There is data that takes longer if we do the chemistry sampling in the water, and that's triggered by high turbidity events or by initiation of the dredging activity. And that data takes a little bit longer, and we need to think about how to publish that.
Yeah, it would be nice to have a dashboard, because the USGS doesn't have many stations either, and there's actually not a lot of monitoring going on. So it's really hard even now to look at some of these things. So whenever because you do the work already, it would be great to have a dashboard available with the data which is actually there. And then chemical obviously takes a little bit longer.
Right. Yeah, great tip. Thank you.
And then it looks like Laura Feldman online might have a question.
Laura?
Hi, yes. We haven't received the bio opinion yet, and I wonder when that's coming.
We haven't. Oh, Hunter's online. This is his favorite project.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So we are working with NIMS on getting the BIOP released. We still have some work to do on it. It's certainly been delayed over there, but we've worked with NIMS to commit in the new year to work on the BIOP. We've set up bi-weekly meetings to work through any remaining comments they might need some help with to move it forward. So you're correct, we do not have a BIOP, but I'm optimistic that we're going to move it forward in the first quarter of 2025.
Can different responsible parties go back and related to because they didn't have the bio-op when they were designing their cleanup, can it be retroactive, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Can it have influence on people who, on parties who have already, done their design?
It's a great question, Laura, and I think something weighing on many of the designers' minds. We are not to that point yet where the BIOP would have such influence that it would significantly change the designs yet, but we are getting close. And so we have certainly put a new emphasis on getting that BIOP out because, we used to have pretty good amount of comfort and, we've got to move these designs forward quite a bit before the BIOP is really needed. But that need is becoming more and more urgent. So I don't think we're there yet that any work would really need redone. Really what we're working with folks is, design your remedy to be protective, and then we'll use the BIOP to determine what kind of mitigation needs to happen. Also, EPA has released a biological assessment that includes a significant amount of information that's sort of a pre-biological opinion that folks can use to kind of figure out where the biological opinion is going. So it's great comment.
Okay, thank you, Hunter.
Thanks, Hunter. All right, more implementability stuff. So considering contracting, the request was to consider including community members on a review team for contractor bids. And there was a citation in the comments to a part of the federal acquisition regulation that would give EPA leverage to force this to happen. The issue is this isn't going to be a federally procured cleanup. We are going to get into agreements with performing parties. They're private entities and they are going to do the work. And so the federal acquisition regulations don't apply. And EPA doesn't have a lever to force this to happen. It's a recommendation in the community impacts mitigation plan, but it's not something that we can require. I know it says yes there, but it probably shouldn't say yes. That should say no. And then the riverbank concerns at 307, this is a comment we passed forward that that's a failing bank. Next slide. Questions? Michael.
Yes, I understand that, I guess with this consent decree that we don't know who these folks are, but I'm just wondering in the future, we probably will know. Is it a possibility that community could reach out to them and work with these folks on would EPA be willing to work with community reaching out to them once it does become known, and that we could have community, input, on those?
Yeah, I imagine similar to the way that there's a connection now through the collaborative to the RD parties. I see a few of them sitting in the room here. I imagine the same thing is going to happen with our remedial action parties as well, that there will be connectivity. So absolutely, yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, recommendation to use some of the mitigation stuff in the SIMP around green remediation in the green remediation plan for this site. That's something we carried forward. We think there's some good information there, especially around diesel particulates that we hope all the design teams consider. Next slide. Climate change. There are a lot of things that are going to potentially happen with climate change. You can see this laundry list on the left. And we think this is important. Also, there's some aspects of cap stability that are going to be really heavily influenced by some climate change stuff. That is the sea level rise. So think about how far up a bank we need to worry about erosion, and also the quantity of water that's going to come down the river, again, for erosion on the top of caps. Some of these other issues are more minor issues. And the way that we design caps, we put in some conservatism because there is some uncertainty, right? We're sampling in certain spots. We're not sampling the whole area, so there's some uncertainty there. Same with like the groundwater movement. All these things we understand are slightly uncertain in our design, and so we tend to over-design the caps to account for that uncertainty. And that conservatism in the design will also help us ride out slight changes due to climate change in the way the cap is functioning. And again, we will be continuing to monitor these caps. So as conditions change in the future, if they do have a significant difference on the protectiveness of the cap, we will be able to see it and modify the cap. Next slide. Do you want me just to go really fast and not take questions? Okay.
We still have 10 minutes.
Okay. Habitat, yes. Habitat preference, this got specific, and we feel like that we have a better tool in place to deal with this, to have designs meet the terms of the biological opinion and the Endangered Species Act that gets at these very same things. Next. Questions? Okay. Presence of lamprey. At this point, the existing BODR didn't mention lamprey, that we agreed that that was an oversight, so we passed that comment forward. And then there's a request for additional information on lamprey. This doesn't feel like the right thing for the Swan Island Basin to put in their design as their 50% design, but it is very interesting, and it could potentially be a topic on a future collaborative meeting. Regarding the dredging impacts, oh, I'm not done. Regarding the dredging impacts on lamprey, as part of the community impacts mitigation plan, we talked with a biologist who studies lamprey in the Willamette River, and what he shared is that the lamprey are just kind of spread throughout. You're equally likely to hit lamprey anywhere you go dig in sediment. So for the lamprey that are in the sediment that we're going to dredge or cap, it's going to end poorly for them. But for all of the other brethren, we're going to leave a much cleaner river that will create a better habitat for lamprey. So that's our lamprey plan. All right, next. Air monitoring, there's a continued focus on air monitoring for PCBs. That's also in our community impacts mitigation plan. So the expectation is that there will be air monitoring for PCBs before the shoreline works, at areas where we're managing sediments on the shoreline. To get a baseline before, and then to conduct regular air monitoring as the operations start up. If we collect enough data and get to the point where we're comfortable that there is not a concern with PCBs being volatilized, we may ramp down that air monitoring. So I don't want to stand up here and promise that we're going to do it monthly throughout the duration of the project. We'll do it at the beginning and then reevaluate. Questions? All right, fish advisory. This is going to be another important thing. When we start remedial action, the plan is to take the fish advisory to zeros, recommending that people not eat any resident fish, but this is being done site-wide. So EPA, through a cooperative agreement, is paying Multnomah County to do this work, and then cost recovering from the PRPs. So really, thanks PRPs for funding this fish advisory work right now, and that will continue. So that's being done site-wide and doesn't need to be handled specifically by the Swan Island Basin team. Next. This is another concern about ensuring that we really think about all the aspects of the way a CAP functions. And the answer is similar to the previous one about climate change, that this is another aspect that leads to a little bit of uncertainty in design that we accommodate. Engineers are very good at this, at adding kind of a buffer of conservatism to their designs. And performance monitoring also is how we know that at the end of the day, we'll be able to test that our remedy is effective. Questions? Next. Reuse of dredge materials. So our ROD specifically says that the materials we remove by dredging will be disposed of in an upland permitted facility. This was something that, we did a proposed plan. This was before my time, but the proposal was to put the sediments in a confined disposal facility in one of the slips in T4. And that was met with a lot of resistance. And so the final ROD came out with an agreement that we would take the sediments off-site to an upland facility. So at this point, that is what we're planning to do. Next. Transportation. Can community be involved in the decision-making process for transportation? This is kind of similar to the contracting. EPA has some levers to force protective action, to force compliance with environmental laws. Since this cleanup will be done by private parties, they will have the ultimate say in how they transport the material, assuming that it meets all of our thresholds. But I do think the collaborative provides a good forum to talk through that. I think there will be a lot of discussion about it, but EPA cannot promise community a seat at that decision-making table. And same thing for the contracting. Next, how many do I have left? Oh yeah, okay.
I have two questions over here, if that's
Okay,
okay. Irina,
great,
and
'cause-
then we'll go to Barbara.
I have a question about this transportation of disposable material. Could EPA advocate that we'll have a path that community knows what roads are used and how frequent?
Oh,
how
absolutely.
frequently the materials are kind of like that at least the community knows when to be aware of what dirty material is on the road.
Yeah, no, there will be full transparency. I think the request was specifically that community be involved in the decision-making process. And the other component that we're planning to stand up during remedial action is the community impacts implementation community. What do we call it? Basically an implementation committee, right? For folks to meet, to allow a space for the regulators and the contractors performing the work and community to meet directly a few times a year. And so there'll be some direct conversations with the folks doing the work, yeah.
And that should be linked to the collaborative group as well. Yeah.
Yes, Barbara Quinn, you said that the contractors, you can't dictate to the contractors how they do the removal. What about best practices such as covering the loads, washing the tires, and maybe traveling during off times, like early morning or late at night or something like that? Is that controllable or no?
The stuff about having a clean operation is absolutely controllable. The stuff about how they use public roads, I think, is a little trickier. But I think everybody's invested in having a cleanup that is effective and positive for the community. And there's a lot of it feels very similar to other construction projects, and the city of Portland has a lot of practice working with folks doing big construction projects on ways that are work for the community. And so we've already had some great conversations with their noise office, for example, and I imagine we'll coordinate with them closely on how to do it as best as possible. Yes to the wheel washing and the whatever else, the clean site.
Okay, and just to make note, we have about 2 minutes left. I know you have just 2 slides, so I'm just going to ask people to hold their questions till we get to the end. And if you do need to leave right at 8, please feel free to do so. And yeah, keep going, Jesse.
So the last 2 slides are just questions that came up that really Swan Island Basin is in the best position to respond to. And so we've passed those questions on to them, and they've happily agreed to provide answers back to Marcus and this community on these questions. And so we'll be looking for those sometime in Q1 of 2025. You can go to the next slide too. I don't need to read these out.
In addition to the questions, I just wanted to add one thing, is that the full, even though some of, what Josie went through was a no in terms of us passing it along to the Swan Island Basin group to have them consider, putting into their 50% document, which is the next one. We passed along the full set of comments or feedback from the WRAG to the group. So they have everything. So just wanted to let you all know that too.
Thus concludes the prepared remarks.